Hello again all, and welcome back. This is going to be part 2 of the lecture on the map of theological ethics. Again, you have the handout, or we'll have it soon to follow along. So this is just a map of the form that I'm already going to send you that explains all this in more detail. So at least you have a hard copy. So in the first lecture, what we looked at is how our values and our conceptions of good and bad and right and wrong, they don't exist just in a kind of a sort of circle all by themselves, or we can isolate them from everything else in either our own lives or our communal lives or even existence itself. That the most comprehensive way to think about ethics, the most comprehensive way to think about politics, is to locate it within a sort of concentric circles that recognize that ethics stands upon a foundation of other kinds of fundamental inquiry. So what we saw last time is that in order to have any form of, and this is all summary, in order to have any form of applied ethics or politics, and here we're talking about policies or laws, we must be applying something, right? It's in the word itself. In other words, we have to have some kind of conception of the nature of good and evil and right and wrong in order to apply that both to our individual lives, and to our social lives. So again, you can think of this both in the 2D model, which you see here, so that it's a relationship of dependency, that applied ethics depends upon ethics, which depends upon epistemology, anthropology, etc. And you can also, at the exact same time, think of it as a 3D model in which you have applied ethics or applied values at the very top, and then everything beneath it, so you can see sort of what's necessary in order to hold everything else up. So in order to have any kind of conception of what I should do right here and right now, or again politically, I need to have some kind of conception of what is right and wrong. That's sort of a theory. Within that theory, I need a hierarchy of value to tell me which values are more important than others. In order to have those values, in order to have those conceptions, I have to know how I know what I know, that I'm not just making it up, that I can first and foremost tell myself why I believe what I believe. It's not just a sheer assertion. And then, of course, able to tell others, make my thinking transparent. In order to say how do I know what I know, I have to have some kind of conception of what not only I am as an I, but also we as a human being. How is it possible for beings such as myself to be in existence? And how is it possible for those beings to have this kind of knowledge? And how is it possible for this kind of knowledge to be communicated among beings? All of that all those are anthropological questions. So I have to have an anthropology as well. Well, in order to have an anthropology, I also have to have an ontology, because I can't answer what the nature of human nature is if I don't have some conception of what nature is, and not just nature in terms of like an ecosystem, a particular area of nature or the natural world, but how everything's put together ultimately, both at the micro level, smallest constituent of reality, and at the macro level, thinking in terms of universe or multiverses. I have to get that right in a sense, because if I don't get that right, well then everything else I'm going to get wrong, or at least it's going to be accidental if I get it right. And in terms of being able to answer what's the nature of nature, I also have to have ultimately then a theology. Theology in the broadest possible sense, understood as an explanation for how it's possible, for the condition for the possibility of everything else that I've just described. So in other words, theology is not some sort of remote questions that just a few elite or otherwise misled eggheads are talking about out there. We can just sort of get on our lives over here. What I want you to do is always just push on the question. Always say, why? Well, why that? And why that? And why that? And what you'll see is that as you push through any particular ethical or political question, you'll find that it's sitting atop or embedded within all these other conceptions of knowledge, of human nature, of reality, and of ultimate reality. So that's all summary. What I want to do today is show how we can use this map to help us think through some different forms of thought, and to see how claims that we make in these outer areas affect the inner output, and the reverse, how claims that we make here necessarily entail other claims out here. So we're going to be playing with the map a little bit today. And what I want you to do is, as you're moving through the rest of the semester and you're beginning to think about your first papers and the final paper and the exam that are going to come up if you have exams in your class, is to think about, well, how do I locate my own conceptions of reality in response to all of these questions? Because while the answer to the question can change, of course it changes. I mean, that's what identifies different forms of thought. That's how we identify different conceptions of reality that are competing with each other and that disagree with each other. So yes, the answers absolutely change, but the questions themselves don't change, and the relationship among the questions doesn't change. So how do I live right here, right now? What is the nature of good and evil and right and wrong? How do I know what I know? What is the nature of human nature? What is the nature of nature or nature of existence? And what's the nature of ultimate nature, ultimate existence? We can't avoid those questions. Those questions are stuck, sort of they're a fixed feature of inquiry itself. And so ultimately each one of us has to come up with our own answers and ensure that it is coherent at each level. So let's start with an example by Friedrich Nietzsche. Now, some of you have read a text called The Madman and the Death of God. If you haven't read it yet, that's okay. We'll explain its major features. But basically, the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche is most famous for a claim that actually appears in this very short reading by Nietzsche, The Madman and the Death of God, that God is dead. And in fact, that's what we see in the text itself. It's a parable about a quote-unquote madman who bursts into a public square in, you can imagine, sort of late 19th century Europe. And Nietzsche is clear that the madman is bursting into a public square where there are all these people having coffee and all these people sort of milling around, that it's an educated populace, and that most of, I'll put educated in square quotes right there, most of the people there, they're already atheists. They don't believe in God. They've gotten beyond this, again, from Nietzsche's perspective, the sort of superstitious idea that there's this ultimate being who exists, who sort of sustains all of reality and serves as a lawgiver, and that which guarantees that ultimately all things will end up justly. That from within this scene that Nietzsche has created, most of the people don't believe that. And so that's why when this madman jumps into the square and he says, God is dead, I'm here to announce that God is dead, most of them what? Well, they make fun of him, right? You can imagine, say, if you're walking down Hollywood Boulevard and you see somebody on the side of the street and they start saying with the megaphone, God is dead, and you're assuming that most of the people already there don't believe in God. They think that they're far beyond, more sophisticated than that. So they start to make fun of him, right? And they ask him, well, where is God gone? Where is this God that you seek? Is he hiding? Is he out at lunch, right? So again, it's one of sneering at him. Now, it's important to note that by the end of the parable, the people are quiet. They're absolutely quiet. So the madman moves them from a disposition of sneering, of looking down, of condescension, to absolute silence. And so it's an interesting question to ask, well, what has happened there in that meantime? One of the potential answers is that what Nietzsche is seeking to do through that parable, through the madman announcing the death of God, is to make people who claim that God doesn't exist responsible for the implications of their views. So Nietzsche is certainly not challenging the idea that God isn't real. He is, in and through this parable, making it clear that given that for him, I'm talking through Nietzsche's perspective, for him, given that God is dead, that we have to live according to that reality, that we can't affirm one reality out here of God's dead and then sort of just keep everything else the same. Polite society and the idea that there's these rules and regulations and that you can go to a court and seek justice, and that there's certain things that should be done and certain things that shouldn't be done, and that we can work for social justice, or that we can fight to have a cleaner world, or that we should seek to overcome climate change, or that we should seek to overcome whatever disparity we're identifying. For Nietzsche, that's all sheer nonsense, absolute nonsense. Because if it's true that God is dead, then everything that idea of God held up in terms of there being a real moral order collapses, absolutely collapses. And so there's nothing left to point to and say, but this is where we're going to extract our conception of the good. It's all nonsense, all equally arbitrary. So let's see how that works. Let's claim with Nietzsche, say out here, well, God is dead. And what he means by saying that God is dead is not that God was once alive, sort of ontologically, that there really was a being at one point who has passed from existence. Nietzsche is a very sophisticated thinker. He knows that that is nonsense, that if God were to exist, then God by definition could not exist. What he means is that the idea of God is dead, that humanity has, quote unquote, advanced to the point where we now see, or at least a lot of people see, that this idea of God is a silly superstition. So the idea is now dead. Well, let's see the implications of that. So again, think of it in a 3D model and a 2D model. Well, if God is dead, what implication does that have for the nature of reality? Well, sometimes you hear people say things like, I think the universe is talking to me, or I feel like there's some kind of meaning and purpose out there. No, I don't believe in God, but I do think that there's some kind of intrinsic meaning or value, or something that I can point to and say, you know, it's written in the stars, or it's written in the fates, or it's sort of my destiny. What Nietzsche would say is, well, that's nonsense. I mean, that's silly psychobabble, right? If God is dead, then that means that existence itself is sheerly arbitrary, absolutely arbitrary, not like a little arbitrary. Things can't be a little arbitrary. It's 100% arbitrary. It's an accident, a cosmic accident, and not just at the very bottom, but all the way through. And that goes all the way through the entire cosmos, all the way through to our little planet, and then our little lives on that little planet, all accidents. And so if God is truly dead, and the idea of God is truly dead, well, then the ontological implication of that is that there's nothing out there at the level of existence that we can point to and say, well, that is meaningful, or that has purpose, or that is something that I can hold on to and say, well, this is actually somehow permanent or not arbitrary. For Nietzsche, nonsense, absolute nonsense. So if it's true that then nature is ultimately totally arbitrary, well, what implication is that going to have for human nature? Well, you see how the thinking unfolds here, right? If you can't squeeze blood out of a stone, right? If arbitrariness is the name of the game, then you're not going to somehow skip through the arbitrariness and then end up on the other side and be like, well, but once we get to humanity, there we know we now have something that's meaningful and has purpose and it's worth fighting for. Not for Nietzsche, right? If ontologically all things are arbitrary and a cosmic accident and just sort of ruled by raw power, well, then anthropologically, that's going to be the same as well, right? We're not going to point to some kind of supreme human nature that sort of unites us all, and that there's some kind of rationality that'll get us to the next point, or some kind of universal value that we all share. Nonsense, right? Nonsense. It's just raw power, arbitrary power. And that's what defines us here. Well, if that's true about who we are, then the only thing that we can possibly know, if we're being honest at the epistemological level, is that truth, right? Is the truth that there is no truth. And so all we can see, again, if we're being honest, if we're not, for Nietzsche, living like children in a fantasy land, which is what he thinks those atheists are doing in the parable, then we see that it's all arbitrary, and all there is power and the exercise of power, which is used arbitrarily, but there's power itself. So if that's the only thing we can know at the epistemological level, well, what does that mean for ethics? Ethics, and another famous book by Nietzsche is called Beyond Good and Evil. His argument there is that evil and good are, well, it's like talking about gnomes and leprechauns, right? I mean, there are things that we can talk about. We can give them conceptual attributes. We can say, well, here's the definition of good and here's the definition of evil, and we can talk all day about them and get really detailed. Or it's like, you know, the world of Harry Potter, you know, like we can spend a lifetime talking about all the different elements of the world of Harry Potter, right? But ultimately, it's what? It's fiction. It's fiction. there's no substance to it. There's no truth to it. And so in his argument beyond good and evil, he's spinning that out, right? Human beings have to live according to the truth that good and evil are ultimately totally empty concepts in terms of their reality. They don't refer to anything either in the human mind or in nature that actually is good or evil. And so ethics for him is sort of the anti-ethic, right? The idea that you live according to power. And that's, for some of you who might know a little bit of Nietzsche, you get this idea of the will to power, the Übermensch, that's what ultimately should define a human being, is the seeking of power and the seeking of the creation of the world according to his or her will. So we become like gods. And that's exactly what we see in the parable of the man and the death of God. Nietzsche says we have to become gods in order to be worthy of the crime that we've committed of destroying God, of killing God. We must become God in God's place. So what that means, again, is no of this fuzzy human rights and I believe in this and follow me in my cause and we're taking it to the streets and we're going to create an online social media campaign. It's like, grow up. This is Nietzsche talking. Grow up. Stop living in this created fantasy land and recognize it's just power. So eat or be eaten. Destroy or be destroyed. Now, to be fair to Nietzsche, he thought that violence was, how do I put this? That violence was boring. Anybody can be violent. So he wasn't interested in violence per se, and he wasn't advocating for violence directly. He was advocating for the will to power to be something along the lines of creating something that's never been created before. But he's 100% consistent here, and he recognizes that if it's true that all of this is the case, that God is dead and so on and so forth, and that ripples all the way through, well then, the outcome is quite clear. I mean, if you're going to be violent and you think it's necessary, well, then be violent. I mean, wipe out a particular city or village or whatever is necessary for the case. Now, I'm speaking about this sort of glibly, right? And that might sound like a little shocking, like you're just sort of, it's just rolling off your tongue, like let's destroy a village or let's destroy a population. Well, I'm trying to inhabit Nietzsche's position here. You see, it is glib. It's not glib in the sense of how he constructs the argument. He very carefully constructs the argument, but it is in terms of its output. It really doesn't matter. Nothing really matters. And so you might as well sort of take this kind of this casual attitude towards existence, understood of its moral content, because whatever you do is equally arbitrary. So you might as well be the most powerful that you can and express that power any way that you will. So that gets us then to the applied ethics. Express your will any way that you will, with no constraints whatsoever, except for the power of other people who are going to be acting against you. So here's a good example of how once we locate a value out here, or I'm sorry, not a value, a fact, I don't necessarily just mean an empirical fact, but a truth, a claim, well, that claim is going to ripple all the way through. And it sort of has this unavoidable logic to it, that if this is true, that therefore this must be true, and therefore this must be true, and so on and so forth. So one of the things that Nietzsche teaches us with this claim is that it is incoherent at the highest level to say something like God is dead here, and then expect to get an output down here or here of something that you want, or something in terms of, well, I want to believe that my life is meaningful. I'm going to say that God is dead, but I want to believe that it's a true statement that my life is meaningful. That's not a delusion. That's just some psychological security blanket I tell myself that it's actually true that I matter, or that the people around me matter, or that I actually do love somebody. No, Nietzsche would say, be honest. And if this is true, therefore that can't be true. So that's one example of how things on the outside affect things on the inside. Let's change this, though, just to give it a different example. Instead of saying, God is dead, we're going to be reading some work a bit later in the semester by a great thinker called St. Thomas Aquinas, who's a medieval thinker, and he has great relevance both for for ethics and for politics. Aquinas is going to argue not that God is dead. In fact, the very opposite. God is the most alive. God is isness itself. God is existence. And one way he expresses that, he says, God is eternal law. That the very definition of God is God must be. God cannot not be. And that gets at this idea that God is, and is in such a way that God is not contingent. God does not depend upon anything else for God's existence, and therefore he sort of necessarily is, and then everything else in existence sort of borrows from that isness. So we'll talk more about what the eternal law means as we move into Aquinas later on, but it's basically that idea. God cannot not be. God is. The biblical way of putting that, is, as we saw in the Old Testament, is Yahweh is the name of God in the Old Testament. And Yahweh literally means, it's translated in different ways, but I am that I am. So what's your name? I am. Isness is my name. I exist is my name. That's my identity, is to exist. Whereas everything else is contingent upon that existence. So if that's true theologically, well, how about ontologically? Well, if it's true that there is sort of a necessary nature at the base, as it were, of everything that's existence in the cosmos, well, then it makes sense to say at the ontological level, what is the nature of nature? That necessary being is going to be refracted into the nature of existence itself. It's not going to be the same. So we're not going to say that the universe is God, but God will be visible in a sense, not empirically, but metaphysically, present in reality itself. So if God is sort of structure and order in and of itself, well, then it makes sense to say that the nature of nature also is going to share in that structure and order. That's going to permeate that whole the whole cosmos, or even multiverses, if that's the case. It's all going to be based upon that one reality. It's going to share in the nature of that reality. Well, if that's true at the nature of nature, well, then at the anthropological nature, if you have reason and order and instruction here, well, then one particular feature of that is, we'll call it humanity, is also going to be participating in that reason and order and structure. And so human nature is going to have a kind of a meaning and purpose to it, and intelligibility to it, that's both written into the cosmos and written into our very nature itself. Now, what's going to make us in part unique, not the only thing, but in part unique for Aquinas at this epistemological level is, well, we can know that. Unlike everything else in creation, setting aside for him the angels, human beings having the image and likeness of God, we can sort of loop around and see who we are and who we are in relationship to God, and see that there is a structure and order both within us, and this, of course, this is all permeated with value and goodness for Aquinas, that it's in us, and that we can know that it's in us, and that we therefore recognize a standard that is both in us and outside of us, and that our sort of the purpose of life is to live according to that standard. In other words, instead of will to power here, we're going to get the natural law for Aquinas. That there is, again, there's a fixed feature of reality that is good in and of itself, and our goal is to live according to it. So at the level of applied ethics or politics, and the creation of our laws, or the identification of what's good and bad and right and wrong, we seek to apply the natural law to those particular features of individual and social existence. So you see here that just by changing one piece of a potential answer to this map, from God is dead to God is the eternal law, everything else changes. And again, it gets at that idea that features of reality, whatever they may be, they're related to each other, and you can't change one part here and not get a different part out here. Again, if you're going to be coherent. So that's one way that we can think about how claims out at this level necessarily affect claims at this level. So you're going to see that in all the authors that we read, and you're also going to see it, I hope, in your own thought as well, that this will help you dissect your own thought and reorganize it. Now, I also said that what we're going to do is we're going to look at how we can move from the inside out as well. So I'm going to move over to this board just briefly. And here, all we really need to show this, for this moment right now at least, We'll start with the applied, and we'll go at the ethics for now. But I want you to be thinking about the whole map as well. Okay. So this is a weird example, but bear with me here because I think it's going to make the point. So every time that you're in a restaurant, even a fast food restaurant, let's say you need to use the facilities, you go in and you're in the United States, and most places have this. And if you're in a place that doesn't have it, it's an interesting question why. You use the facilities and then you go wash your hands. Now, you're going to see a sign, right? A sign next to the sink, no matter what kind of eating establishment you're in. What does that sign say? Well, it says all employees must wash their hands. Now that you've taken this class, I hope you look at that sign and you're like, huh, that looks like a law. That looks like a policy. I wonder what it's built upon. Why? Why must all employees wash their hands? Well, now the first answer to that is kind of obvious, but let's first recognize that where we are here, let me get a different color. Where we are here is at something very applied, right? It's not saying all people must wash their hands. If you go into a Home Depot or a non-food eating establishment, you don't see the same sign. So it's very particular, right? So we're saying all employees must wash hands. Okay. But then the question is okay, well, that's an applied principle. That's at the very top of this whole substructure. So let's ask, well, why? What is that principle based upon? Well, again, as I said before, the first answer is it's pretty obvious here, right? It's what we're going to be doing is we're going to be creating an inverted pyramid, meaning we're going to get more and more general as we move up. So the first thing we could say is, well, it's because we don't make others sick. So because we believe in the principle, or because we think it's good not to make others sick, therefore we believe that all employees must wash hands, recognizing that having dirty hands can contaminate food and that can make people sick. So don't make other people sick, therefore all employees must wash hands. But note here that don't make others sick, it's a more general principle, right? It's higher up in the hierarchy. Why? Because not making others sick applies to washing your hands if you work at a food establishment, but it also applies in other contexts as well. It applies to covering your mouth when you sneeze, not going to work if you think that you have something contagious, wearing gloves when you're treating people if you work in a healthcare environment, etc. So it's more general, but we're not going to be satisfied there, right? We're going to say, well, why do we believe that we shouldn't make others sick? Right? Well, I think that's obvious why I believe that, but let me specify. We shouldn't make other people sick because, well, we're going to get to something more general. Don't harm others. Well, that's more general, right? Because we believe that we shouldn't harm others, therefore we don't want to make them sick, therefore we have this law and policy that we should wash their hands. But at that higher level, right, don't harming others, well, that applies to lots of different things, even that don't have to necessarily do with health understood as bacteria or viruses, right? Not harming others would include everything from not driving drunk, obeying the speed limit, not hitting people, especially if you start importing ideas of psychological harm, like, not mistreating people, not abusing people. Think of all the laws, all the morality you can pack into that principle of not harming others, one of which is don't make others sick, one of which is that all employees must wash their hands. So you see, again, the hierarchical relationship, and we're getting more and more general. But then we have to say, well, why not harm others, right? It makes sense that we shouldn't want to harm others. But again, I want to specify. Well, here we're going to part ways, okay? Now, one way in this direction, we're going to say money. That the reason that we don't want to harm others is because it could somehow cost us. This is like a cynical rendition of the golden rule. So I believe it's wrong to harm others, not because I think it's actually wrong to harm others, but because I'm scared that they could somehow harm me, and in particular, that they could take away something that I like, something that I want, something that I possess, and that's ultimately money. So because I believe that it's wrong to harm others, surely for cynical reasons, because I don't want to get harmed, therefore I don't want to harm others, therefore I don't want to make other people sick, therefore all employees must wash their hands. And so you say, well, what's the big deal then? You know, if you get the same output, who cares about this? If up here people disagree, it's the same output, might as well just all live cynically, right? Okay, fair enough. We can see that on one output we're going to get wash your hands, even if we start from a cynical point higher up. But let's say that we have a different example down here. So there's this new meat, which is non-meat, that's come out. You all heard of this? It's called the Impossible Burger. And apparently it's like a burger. I haven't eaten one yet, but I probably will. It's like they've mutated the genetic composition of soy and maybe some other plant proteins to make it juicy, and that it's cookable. And so it kind of looks like a burger in terms of emitting juices when it's cooked, and might even sort of taste like a burger as well. Okay, so you know what I'm talking about. So let's say that you work for a food company, and you're the one who's come up with this Impossible Burger. Now, disclaimer, I'm not saying that Impossible Burgers will make you sick. I don't know. This is totally hypothetical, okay? But let's say that you're the food chemist who came up with this, and you have this like eureka moment in the lab where you make soy juicy and delicious. That's a serious eureka moment, right? Soy is delicious. Okay, it happened, let's say. So you know this is going to be big. You run to the lab, the person who's charged of the lab, and then both of you run to make a meeting with the board of directors as soon as possible. So you meet with them and you say, look what we've just done. We have replicated the taste of a burger. Let's say you work for some huge burger company, huge fast food, international fast food conglomerate. You say, we've replicated the taste of a burger, but we're not using meat. And they say, interesting. They try it, like, wow, that really tastes pretty good. And you say, and here's the best part. We don't have to pay for the production of cows and the slaughtering of them and all of the transport issues, the refrigeration, the freezing, all of that. So basically what we're going to be able to do is radically cut costs and produce the same product or similar product at the other end, which of course means what? A lot more profit. Like you're going to make a lot more money now. So they're very happy about that, right? Because they're going to produce the same thing at the end or a very similar thing and cut tons of costs in the middle. They'll probably charge the same because it's a similar product from the consumer's eyes. And so now they're going to be rich. They're already rich, but like really, 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 really rich. So great. But then you say as a food scientist, you got some scruples, and you say, well, okay, but here's the thing. It's also appears to be the case that this one, and again, it's just purely hypothetical, but it's just for the sake of illustration. It also appears to be the case that this genetic mutation that we've done in some other studies appears to have the possibility of causing cancer. And so now the executives who are munching their burgers go, right? That's caught their attention. You mean this could cause cancer? So yes, there's actually some pretty reliable studies that show this particular mutation can have these impacts. And so they think, oh, so now the whole thing's going to collapse, right? They're thinking, oh man, we can't sell this if it's going to cause cancer, that we could lose everything, right? But then you, the food scientist, you lose your scruples. You say, but it usually happens 30 to 40 years after or it sort of has that kind of incubation period to work. It takes a long time, in other words, from the actual eating of the product to the actual production of the cancer. Okay, so again, hypothetically here, and we're assuming a cynical perspective, which can be fair to assume, right, in some context, a cynical perspective. And so now, what are the board members thinking? They're thinking, okay, so we know that this likely causes cancer, but we also know that it can't be detected, or at least it can't be detected for so long. One, I'll be retired by then, so it won't affect me individually. I'll have my pension and I'll be happy. Two, even if I'm thinking about the well-being of the company, it's so far remote that it would take a long time, and we can do a good PR campaign and show how, you know, we're being slandered and lied about. So in other words, we're going to do a calculated risk and say, well, since my interest is money, that's my motivating foundational value, we're going to go with it. We're going to go with this mutated plant gene and produce it in order to make more money. Well, why have I gone through this whole hypothetical example? Because in the case of washing your hands, it's like pretty easy to detect what happened. Oh, there was hepatitis C that somebody got sick with. Well, where did that? You can trace that back to a particular worker usually, or a particular supply of food. Whereas if something is 30 to 40 years out there, it's really difficult, if not impossible, to trace it back. So if money is my dominant value, then I'm going to say, well, not harming others, not concerned about. Don't make others sick, not concerned about. Not concerned about the well-being of people at the point of entrance into where they're actually getting this product. In other words, my applied ethic does change because I think I can't get caught. So that's why it matters what you actually believe. In some cases, yes, there can be overlap between somebody who's cynical and somebody who actually believes in protecting, you know, innocent life or something like that. Sometimes there can be overlap there. But when, by definition, the person who doesn't care about innocent life at all can get away with it, they're going to try and get away with it. Whereas the person who does believe in innocent life is not going to try and get away with it because they're going to be acting according to the value that they think is true. So, at least ideally. So instead of the money option, we could go the other side and say, don't harm. And we'll put it this way. Innocent life, and I'm putting innocent here because it gets more complex when you start looking at potential criminal violations. So we'll set that aside for now. Innocent life is good or valuable. So you could say, because I believe that innocent life is good and valuable, again, where innocent is an important qualification here. We'll talk about more later. Innocent life is good and valuable. Therefore, I believe that you shouldn't harm others. Therefore, I believe that you shouldn't make others sick. Therefore, I believe that we should have laws that require all people who are working with food, serving it to others in a public capacity, should wash their hands. Now, even if that means that I'm not going to make as much money as I would otherwise, it still means, again, if I'm acting consistently according to the values I say that I have, I'm going to do it. Well, now here is where things get really interesting, because here you're at the ethical level. You're here, right? You are here in the map. So then the question becomes, okay, you've just made a claim about sort of the most foundational value that you have. Human life is intrinsically valuable or something like that. Okay, good. How do you know that? Really, how do you know that? Like, how are you going to demonstrate that to yourself, that statement, that you're not just making it up? And then what theory of anthropology is embedded both in the claim that humans are valuable and in the claim that humans can know that they're valuable? And then what is the nature of nature so that human beings as such can exist? And what is the condition for the possibility at the theological level so that all of this can be the case? So you see how you just washing your hands and like a in and out, it's a good place. And you're looking at the sign and all of a sudden you're thinking about, does God exist or not, right? If you just push on the question, push it through all the way, you start getting at that theological level, even with the most particular starting point. So I really hope that that's what you're going to be doing, not only for the semester, but forever now, for your whole life, is pushing through those questions, pushing through those claims, whether it's a law or it's a belief, a moral belief or value, whatever the case, asking why? And you'll see that it's all upon these substructures. So to conclude, I want to use an example that some of you have read, depending on which class you're in, from the Declaration of Independence. Because here we have a classic example, and of course there's many of these, but here's a good one that demonstrates that the founders of the country, of the United States, were highly aware that in order to identify the justification for why they were leaving the political affiliation, why they're cutting their political affiliation with Great Britain, that they couldn't just assert it, right? They couldn't just say, we're done. We're finished. We want to put on some Continental Army uniforms and wear some great triangle hats. And that's why we want to do this. No, like they had to philosophically justify it. So we see that philosophical justification in the actual Declaration of Independence itself. So I'm just going to read a little bit of it and map it here. All right, so this is Declaration of Independence. And for those of you who also have the Bill of Rights, you can also see this Bill of Rights all based upon the same philosophical foundation. So starts off the preamble. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bonds which have connected them with one another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes. They're saying the reason we're doing this because we think we have to do this to make it clear that we should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of people to alter or to abolish it and to instigate a new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So what do we have here? We have a lot. It's an amazing document for many reasons, and not just historically, but philosophically as well, because it's highly self-aware that, again, it has to build up its claims in order to justify a particular action. So what do they justify? At the level of applied politics, what they're saying is they want to create a new nation. That what they're seeking to drive is they're seeking to say we're going to create a new nation, and ultimately embedded within this is that we'll resist if you don't allow us to create a new nation. So this is also justification for violence potentially, which the founders think would be justified violence. So in order to create a new nation, it has to justify that by laying out all of its conception of what is ultimately good. So it lays out its conceptions of what constitutes good government and the values that undergird that good government, the whole purpose for government to exist. And so it gets to a theory of what the purpose of government in and of itself is, which is embedded in a deeper theory of what? Well, ultimately of anthropology, but we'll get to that. Epistemologically, it says very clearly how the document thinks that it knows that everything that it's saying is true. It says it openly. Now, we can question whether or not it's coherent, but it says it. We take these truths to be self-evident, meaning just as you can't think of like a 1 and a 0 at the same time, you can't say a 0 and a 1, and someone says, well, why can't you think of a 0 and 1? You say, I can give you no explanation for that. My mind is just, it's impermissible for my mind to conceive of a 0 and a 1 as the same thing in the same way. There's the law of identity and other logical laws. Well, the founders just taking, it's like, you can't give an explanation. It's just sort of embedded into our mind itself that human beings are equal and of such a nature, right? So at the epistemological level, it's saying this is the way that things are about human nature, and about human nature, given that human beings are of this way, that also is going to justify the separation of the United States from Great Britain to create a new nation. So what's it saying anthropologically? That we are equal. But then the question is, well, how could we be equal? Like, what, we don't look equal. What would be the justification for saying that we're equal? It says it very clearly at the ontological and the theological. It says the God of nature and nature's God. That sort of holds up this entire structure that's getting them to the point that says that we are separating from Great Britain. So here's the question. Historical, but also philosophical. If they didn't believe in this God of nature and of nature's God, in other words, if they pulled out the theological rug from the Declaration of Independence, could the rest of it still stand? And I don't just mean the justification for revolution and for separation, but also the claim that human beings are equal and that we're endowed with natural rights, and that those natural rights justify a particular kind of government whose sole purpose it is to protect those rights? Would all of that also have to collapse as well? And if so, what in the world could possibly replace that theological foundation and be built up in such a way so that we could get to a similar output where there's equal human beings who have things called rights, and that those rights get refracted through the government, and then the government's job is to protect those rights? What else could we potentially use? I mean, I'm leaving that first as an open question, both for politics and for ethics, but it's one that we have to answer. So moving forward, be thinking about all of this, both the first lecture and the second lecture, as you seek to interpret the text that we're reading, the ideas that we're engaging, and perhaps most importantly, coming to your own conclusions on them. So, to be continued. I'll see you in a little bit in the next lecture. Take care.